visible?
Yes.
Can you see it? Okay,
yes.
Perfect. So I would like to share with you how we have moved from doing research that I started practically alone over maybe almost 25 years ago on gender in planning at the School of Architecture in Madrid, and how we have moved from that research that I did for many years until maybe in between around 6-7 years ago, things started to change because of legislative changes. And in the last 5 years, not only legislative changes, because these were very linked to the fact that there had been this amount of research, and also there had been quite a bit of activism by professional planners and also by women's associations, and also by women getting into government structures. I personally was in government for a number of years, and I participated in the drafting of some of that legislation, and then many more legislation followed, and now for the last, let's say, 5 years, there's a fair amount of very innovative work going on, initiated by local and regional and national governments in Spain and also in Europe and in some other countries. But I think that the work, the things that are happening in Spain, the initiatives and the projects and plans are quite innovative. And this is what I would like to share with you. So I started this work doing practically research. The first things that I did were in the late 1990s and early the year 2000, 2002, 2000. In those years, I did a number of research projects that were funded by a public. It was the first time that it was the first time somebody asked them for that kind of project. So they funded me a number of projects, and that was the beginning. And so later this has consolidated in the creation of the UNESCO chair. So the UNESCO has recognized this 20 years plus work of gender in planning, architecture, and STEM with the creation of the chair, which is the only UNESCO chair on gender that is located in a technical university and addresses technological fields like planning and architecture and related, because we also do some things related to innovation in industrial design. So we work in these fields that you can see here, which are the normal fields let me see where I can put this so that it's smaller. These are the normal fields that for a planning department in engineering university, as is our university, and we do research, we do dissemination, we do in public engagements with institutions, consultancy and technical assistance. Obviously, we do education and professional training as well, and strategic expert advice to governments and also to multilateral and international organizations like different UN agencies and the European Commission. So these are some of the publications that we have been doing across these years related to architecture, planning, and transportation. Some of these are available PDF for free on the internet, and anybody who is interested can look at them. And those are a selection of the most recent. Two of them you have just mentioned them. The book by Routledge, very recent, and the one by Ashgate of 5 years ago. And then the first time that the Town Planning Review did a special issue on gender and planning. And then this last. That's another special issue that has come this year, that it's a summary of things happening in Spain with contributions, for instance, also some of them by the people, the decision makers in the governments themselves. So they also provide the perspective from governments and public institutions. We have also worked on the issue of supporting women in institution and structural change of institutions, women in research and academia, and some of these publications, most of these are accessible on the internet. And the results of this is the result of an expert group that I chaired for the European Commission on how to promote gender equality in academic institutions. So we participate a lot on European projects. The European Commission is funding a number of projects, particularly in the field of promoting women in academia and structural change. And now it's starting also to get into substantive areas related to planning, for instance, women in transportation. And the Gender Innovations Project that is being updated and it's coming out in the next month has a whole section that I have directed on gender and cities and transportation, with a number of new case studies that we have done in the last year. So this is like the European, it's like a European toolkit addressed to researchers that want to participate in European research projects. It's like it would be the equivalent to the NSF in the US. And we also participate in a number, in this process, working in networks has been very important. And I have initiated a number of these, like the European GDAS group, which reunites the pioneering people that that started working on these topics in Europe. In the last 20 years, I started this group in the year 2000. And then this is another network that was funded by the COST. COST is a European cooperation project that funds networks on emerging fields of research. And it supports networking activities like short-term scientific missions, training events, position papers and publications, conferences, and working group meetings. So this has been very important in for instance, the book on the Fair Shared Cities was the result of work carried out under the Gender STE network. And we do every year, we have been doing it for a number of years, international conference series in gendering, in which, well, you know, conferences are very important tools for advancing, particularly in new areas for research and practice. I would like just to point out this project, that it's an ongoing project. It's called Gender Equality Academy. This is a European funded project to create teaching and educational tools on gender in different technical areas, and we are holding a summer school next year. So anyone interested might be able to participate. We don't know still if it's going to be online or it will be physically here. If it will be held physically. So let me now go into the topic of gender in planning, which has been recognized by the new urban agenda, which from among its 175 paragraphs, there are like 34 that includes references to gender and women. Some of those references are not really very substantial, but they are there anyway, and they indicate that there's an issue to look at and to consider. And this is what we work within the Advisory Group on Gender Issues, AGI, which is the advisory group to the Executive Director of UN Habitat, of which I am a member. And then the Agenda 2030 has the number 5 goal, which is equality. But gender is across many other of the goals. So both the international agendas are really really contributed to set a policy framework for advancing on integrating gender into the disciplines and the practice related to the built environment. So what would be some gender concepts relevant to transportation and planning? Gender studies have provided us with a number of conceptual tools that are very relevant to the way we build cities. Probably the main one is the concept of care. The care is this concept that is used to describe paid and mostly unpaid work performed by adult individuals on behalf of children, the old, the sick, and the overall functioning of the household. So care it's a very basic concept of gender studies, and it's very key to understanding cities from a gender perspective, because care activities imply a very different use of transportation systems and very different use of the city. And this is related to gender roles, to those activities that men and women undertake on behalf of others, and implying a sexual division of labor that is not, it's changing slightly, but not really very much. And we have seen this during the pandemic. We have seen that it's women who have undertaken most care activities in the home, without childcare, with school closed, and mostly irrespective of who was working or keeping the employment within households. So the time use statistics across Europe and also in the US, they show that it's women mostly who do these activities of care because of sexual divisions of labor, by which caring tasks, all these activities needed for the maintenance of life that the pandemic has really brought to the forefront. It's women who undertake them, and the gap is not significantly, the gender gap in these activities is not significantly being reduced. And so this implies, in this scheme, you can see in a very schematic way what this might be in terms of daily tasks that persons do when they undertake care responsibilities, as compared to what people who don't take care responsibilities do in the city. So it's a far more complex and intensive use of urban space when you have those activities, and also taking into account that today most women are also participate in the labor force, so also are member have an activity in paid employment. Other relevant concepts relate to gender violence that has to do with safety in urban space. But here we have to have a couple of concepts quite clear. One is that most gender violence does not occur in public space. It occurs in the home by known relatives, and very often persons in the family. Also that most people who are actually assaulted in public space, albeit not from a sexual in a sexual way, but a physical violence, it's men. But the issue is not really the actual numbers of crimes. It's the issue. The problem is really the subjective perception of unsafety, because this is what makes women not to move around the city and go to places during some times of the day, or in some specific sections of the city. And then in a universal design that relates to the differences in physicality, the different sizes of body, the different strength, is also very relevant, particularly at smaller scales of architectural design. How does this relate to planning? Because the foundations of modern planning, the Athens charters and functionalism, it's still the core of how the planning machineries work around the world. Even if we've known for a few decades in the 1960s about the limitations of the functionalist approach, these concepts are embedded into planning techniques like zoning. Even if zoning might be made more flexible, it's still the core and the underlying concepts that are embedded into planning techniques and planning machineries and bureaucracies are very much the Athens Charters and this idea of separating functions in the city. And the underlying assumptions behind this way of looking at the city is it's mostly the personal, among others, of course, it's not the only, but among the underlying assumptions is the personal experience of those living the city without care responsibilities. Paid employment is a main focus. Housing is seen as a place for leisure and not for its care implications, and transport is the means to link the spaces assigned to these functions. So there are these unquestioned ideas, often and mostly unconscious, on gender roles and sexual divisions of labor implicit in urban planning practices. This was studied in the late 70s and early 90s by Dolores Hiding from the School of Architecture of Yale. And she published these wonderful books where she analyzes the American suburb from a gender perspective. So these experiences and needs of the persons who assume care responsibilities are not made explicit, and they don't receive the same attention or priority in policies and plans, and then resource allocation or investment decisions. So this is very clear, for instance, in the field of transportation, and there's a fair amount of empirical research, maybe because it's a field that is easily quantifiable, and there's a lot of evidence of the gender differences in transportation. Men travel longer distances, women use more different transportation modes, they have less access to a private car, not in the US. In the US it's quite equal, but generally in the world. But this is changing for the segment of young mothers, and this is due to the fact that when you have kids, with the kind of cities that we have built in the last decades, it's impossible to do all the things that you need to do with the kids and all the implements that you carry when you travel with kids without a car. So this is the only segment of women who have the same access to car than men across geographies. Women travel for more different purpose because of all these many different tasks related to daily living. Time is, results on time are not so different. Sometimes in some studies it's men, sometimes it's women. This is the one variable where differences are not consistent. Women do a higher number of trips. Those trips are shorter and of a special, of a polygonal shape, linking different what are very often chained trips. Women do one chain of the trip for one purpose and another chain for another thing, and you link all these tasks that you need to do in order to keep the household functioning and taking care of the kids and other persons. And the geographical scope is smaller. The age of voluntary cessation of driving is higher for men. It's very difficult for men to stop driving. And then there are issues of safety that have to do, on the one hand, with smaller body size and the fact that safety devices were originally and still are mostly designed for a body that is a male body. And so the injuries are accidents have a worse impact on women than on men. And there are also, of course, issues of ergonomy related to body sizes and body strength. And we see trip chaining is a very important concept. Women do more trip chaining, although this is slightly reducing, but again, as care tasks, the gap is not reducing that significantly. So in the year 2008, I did research work for the Ministry of Transportation in Spain. They asked me to analyze from a gender perspective the main transportation service in Spain. And after I finished this research, I think my head continued thinking about it, and I came up with this idea. I had identified a number of biases in the way the data were collected and the way they were analyzed, even the way they were visually represented. There were big biases in graphical representations. But then I found out, I came up with this idea that many of the trips done for care purposes are hidden under other heading. This is a fairly standard categorization of travel purposes. These are used by the Spanish survey done by the national government, but it's very similar to anything done in the US or in other countries. And so the idea that came to me is that below, under, or within those trips that appear under the heading shopping, strolling, escorting, visits, other, many of these trips are really related to what in gender studies we call care activities. And I said, what if we give this a name, an umbrella, under the umbrella category of care, mobility of care, and we do a specific service to be able to separate within shopping, within strolling, within any of these, what are trips related to care activities for the maintenance of the home or the care of other persons from activities that are personal or real leisure. And so I did this estimate. This was a totally arbitrary hypothesis. What if 2/3 of shopping are care related? It's related to the home. It's not personal shopping. Again, strolling, maybe 1/3, maybe 1/3 of visits, maybe 1/3 of other are care related to trips related to care. And so under these arbitrary assumptions, within this transportation survey that was done by the Spanish government in the year 2000, it would end up that about 20% of trips would be related to care. But again, this was an arbitrary assumption I did some years ago. And so after that, I did with a student of mine, she did her PhD designing a specific survey to really quantify that and to measure it and to separate what was care trips from personal trips or leisure trips. And the analysis that we did was for the population between 30 and 45 years in the region, in the metropolitan area of Madrid. And we came up to this result that 29% of the trips were related to care, while 33% were related to employment. And those trips would be like, within the traditional categories, they would be like embedded into this. Into these standard categories of travel. But this was a specifically designed survey to quantify this. And then what is very interesting is to look at the sex distribution of these trips, because we see that trips related to employment, in this segment of the population, there's a significant gender gap, with men doing more trips. But the trips related to care, the gender gap is much bigger, so that men do very few of care trips. So we have done these similar studies in some cities. For instance, we've done one in the city of Nairobi for UN Habitat, and we found here that women do one additional trip. Those trips are very long. They're the trips that they do because the transport infrastructure, this is the only public transportation that they have in Nairobi, the matatu systems. So the survey was done with matatu users. And we found that, and so trips are quite long. They are around an average of 40 minutes. And women do one additional trip. They do one more trip than men. Women users do travel longer distances. The purpose of women's additional trip is related to care tasks, and it's done before or after going to work. And the length of this trip is not shorter than the trips to the workplace. Also, we found out that a significant number of women do not travel because of concerns of sexual assault, but men were also concerned about safety, albeit not of a sexual nature. And so this needs also be taken into account in policies. And that many women travel despite of safety concerns at night, and these are mostly, excuse me, related to employment. So this has an impact on transportation policy because we're improving the knowledge base when we produce data of greater quality, validity, and relevance, because we are really looking at the different realities of people's lives. And when we unveil the specific transportation needs of persons in relation to the gender roles and independently of sex, this better explains the impact of transportation systems on the gender roles and tasks persons assume in their daily living. And obviously this can contribute to improve policies, plans, and programs, because we're producing empirical evidence needed to integrate care needs among the priorities of transportation policies. And this will allow to design transport systems which are more equitable because they will be more adapted to the needs of persons. And again, this will have an impact on economic development, and because of the better integration of women in the labor force, and also to improve the overall quality of life of everyone, not only of women. So this is work that we do for quantifying and describing these different mobility patterns. We also do other type of studies for in transportation and public space that are of a qualitative nature. We do these are called exploratory safety audits, and this is a methodology that was initially developed in Canada in the 1990s, and it's now used widely by UN Women and many other organizations around the world. And it's a methodology that allows with women who leave the neighborhood, and we do it with a combination with our students, and we combined the participatory, the exploratory walks with women who live in the neighborhood, and then we do a selection of the different profiles of women, elderly, young, different ages and groups and ethnicities, or whatever is relevant for the neighborhood that we want to analyze, and we do this preparatory workshop with them. And then we also do in parallel, we do with our students a technical analysis and mapping physically in plants and physically on the field. And then we overlap the result of these two sources of analysis. And the results are very interesting. Sometimes they overlap, sometimes they don't overlap. Because obviously the knowledge that the women who live there bring into the analysis is different. It has a different connotation quite often. And so we did this in Prado Longo Park, which is in a southern district in Madrid. Quite with a bit of conflict, and we came up with recommendations to the city which were slightly different to what the city was planning to do. We have done work for ADIF, which is the public corporation that manages all train stations and all the rail network in Spain, and they asked us to provide recommendations for the design of some high-speed train stations that were being rebuilt, refurbished, and also for some segments of the rail as they impact on the urban fabric. For instance, this is the Atocha station in San Sebastián in northern Spain. It's a fairly big station, and we did these recommendations for improving the design that addresses this topic, addressed a number of gender-relevant topics, some of them addressing safety things, safety and security, others addressing maintenance and quality of space, and others addressing ways of improving the travel experience of persons traveling with other persons who need help, whether it is persons with a disability, elderly, or the young. And again, we also look at the specific realities of the people who work in this kind of infrastructure of time, and because there are gender issues of hours working for women. This is another, the stations had quite different qualities in terms of their urban insertion and the way the relevant issues were not the same across for instance, this one was in a very small town. So the big issue was was how to integrate all these segment of the railway into the landscape and all the crossings. And also during the process of construction, because these are quite long-term works, and you need to address these issues during the process of construction. So another field in which we have worked for the national government is on gender and housing. We did a pre-normative study on gender and housing for the national government that will feed into an upcoming housing legislation. The national government has its main competence in housing relates to a housing finance plan. That includes, that funds different types of affordable housing. So it includes a fairly significant number of regulations, also of design of housing that is able to receive that kind of funding. And then we have also done, we have advised the Basque government, but the Basque region is a region in northern Spain, and they approved last year Decreto de Habitabilidad. This is a regional level act regulating the housing sector, both public and private housing. So it regulates all sorts of design and standards and technical issues related to housing. And we did a number of recommendations that were included into this piece of legislation related to minimum size of bedrooms, minimum size of kitchens, standards for storage, criteria for security design of common spaces, criteria for functional relationships between kitchen and dining spaces. And these vary somehow in some cases between subsidized and market rate housing. And now I'm going to mention some work that we have been doing at the regional and territorial scale. We have done for the region of Extremadura a technical annex to the regional land use and territorial plan. Land use and territorial planning legislation is in Spain of regional competence. The national government has a very small competence on legislation in this field. So it's the regions who have the legislative capacity. And the region of Extremadura decided to integrate gender concerns and to do it through a technical annex to the law, in which specific recommendations and criteria to be integrated at the different levels of planning, from the regional to the municipal level, and for the different typologies of urban structures in the region. And we did that work for them. And we are now finishing up a manual for use of decision makers and professionals in both public and private sectors for the implementation of this. And for the Basque government, we did 4 years ago the gender component of the regional plan. And I would like to explain briefly what the content of this is. The regional plan, it's called the DOT, Directrices de Ordenación del Territorio, and the regional government, the Basque Country is a region that has 3 main cities, and then a number of medium and smaller sized towns, and a very rich countryside. Quite populated, I mean, and very much integrated into the overall functioning of the region. This plan, this dot, were an update of the first ones that had been approved 20 years before. So in order to recommend what they could integrate, how they should address gender issues, the key aspect to consider that we recommended were the gender roles and paid care work, sexual divisions of labor and their impact on the use of the city by men and women, the gendered perceptions of safety in urban space and transportation and their impact on women's access to employment and services, the feminization of poverty and intersections of gender with other factors, including female household heads, age, ethnicity, immigration, or disability, and participation of women in decision-making, technical staff, and participatory processes, including gender expertise and administrative structures for gender mainstreaming policy. So the idea was to propose an urban model that would be an urbanism of care that takes into account the concept of care and its implications for planning and transportation, and to identify a number of actions and measures proposed that are centered on this idea of care. So the plan had 8 thematic domains, and we selected 4 for gender actions because of priority, the ones that were more important for gender issues. The first one, urban environment and territorial planning. The second, sustainable mobility. The third, governance. And the fourth, rural environment. So because I can't go into the detail of everything, I will just mention the lines of action that we proposed for the domain of urban environment and territorial planning. And we recommended compulsory indications for land reserve for care facilities within municipal land use plans and zoning regulations. I think the pandemic has really brought this to the forefront, the care of the elderly and the care of the young. Plans for care facilities and then indications for land reserves, and then the plans for the care facilities. And pilot projects are very important and useful tool for starting new areas of policy like this, because they bring visibility, they allow for innovation and for experimenting. So we recommended pilot projects through open calls and public competitions. Financial incentives for gender-related actions included in programs, plans, and projects by local governments. Guidelines, manuals, and briefings for good practice for gender mainstreaming comprehensive plan and regenerations projects. Regeneration of neighborhoods is a very important policy that is being developed now in the Basque Country. So addressing the gender dimensions of this regeneration of neighborhoods it's very key. And then specific measures to be integrated in housing plans. Identification of locations considered as unsafe through participatory processes and actions for improving safety, and guidelines, briefings, and manuals for public space design and public facilities to be developed by both the regional and the municipal governments. We also recommended a number of basic cross-cutting recommendations that included institutional capacity building, create and use expert knowledge, cover sufficient substantive domains of planning, regulatory changes needed for continuity in time, small-scale and large-scale actions, pilot projects as instruments for innovation, learning, dissemination, and visibility, women-targeted actions, and also mainstreaming measures, and sufficient elements with transformative capacity. From these ones, for instance, I would say that the compulsory indications for land reserves are the ones that have a more potential for transformative capacity. Then at the scale of the municipality and a smaller scale, we are working in a number. We have worked and are working in a number of urban regeneration projects. in particularly this modification of the general urban plan of Madrid for the Madrid Nuevo Norte, which is the regeneration of a big section of tract of land in northern Madrid around the train station of Chamartín, including a new city. It's the size of Canary Wharf in London or La Défense in Paris, and it includes over 10,000 new units, a new CBD, and a new multimodal transportation hub, and so on. So it's a very big regeneration project, and we did the architects were Richard Rogers, and the engineering was Arup and other engineering companies, and we worked together with them for a whole year in the design of the project, participating in the decisions, in the design decisions, and we did training for all these technical offices. And then we also did the gender impact assessment, which is it's an instrument required by law for all pieces of legislation in Spain. And we covered these topics for the gender impact assessment. And it was done at the master plan level and at the urban design level for each of the 4 sub-areas. I think I don't have much more time left because I've been speaking for a long time now. But if you want, I could go into some details of some of the things that were included in the design and how, and then in the gender impact assessment also. But for instance, there were issues about addressing safety in the building and planning regulations, for instance, about how to ensuring visual control in ground floors and how this was introduced into the regulations, and then different recommendations and ways in which the mix of use and the access was warranted, and how this was when the kind of planning document you're working with does not address to the detail of regulate or the kind of regulation or the kind of issue that is relevant from a gender dimension. The way we have addressed this is that we indicate that a gender responsive report is mandatory to justify in the next regulation, in the urban planning project that come next, to justify if the project meets basic requirements related to gender equality and supporting care activities. We did this in issues related to lighting, and for instance. So let me just finish. I have some slides of possible implications from a gender perspective of the COVID pandemic and the post-COVID, but I don't know if I have the time. Please do tell me if I have some time to go into this, or maybe you want to leave it for later. I don't hear you.
Yeah, I think it would be good to have some question and answer, and
yes,
maybe we could touch.
Yeah, we can leave it for the question and answer if you want to. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I will leave it here, and thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thank you. That was really amazing. So from the audience, some questions for Madariaga. And Brittany, if somebody's sending in questions on the chat, could you field those? But just ask. Questions, anyone?
I'll ask a question.
Okay.
I have to go to another meeting in a few minutes, so excuse me for leaving early, but there was so much information there. I'm probably going to watch this again later to try and absorb it all. But I thought I was really interested in the idea of thinking about care facilities as a kind of infrastructure that we would plan for and make sure that we have throughout cities. And it also makes me think about the way we plan for housing, that we need to make sure also that we have households of different ages and other types, so that that infrastructure also kind of facilitates the location of, you know, families of and households of different ages and generations throughout cities as well. Is that, so is that idea of planning for care facilities widely done in Spain, or is this a recommendation that you know, has it been taken up a lot, I guess?
Well, we have recommended it, and we have included it in the Basque government has included it into the regional plan. It's a new idea. I mean, the Spanish land use legislation has a like a regulation that includes standards for land reserves to all different sorts of facilities like education, health, cultural, everything, public green spaces and so on. And those are defined as standards related to population or surface of office space, for instance. And what I recommended the Basque government is that the same way there are standards for land reserves that address educational, health, culture, and other social things, there should be standards that address care facilities for the young and the elderly. And that this needs to be defined. I mean, you need to study it first, what these standards should be. So this is the recommendation that we did, that there's that this topic is addressed as in the same way that standards for other facilities, and that it is considered across the board as something that has to be provided for with the land reserves. This is a planning technique in Spain, that it's land reserves, that they are compulsory for those uses that are taking up from the market in a way, because they are standards that have to be reserved in planning for these uses, so that they are assigned obviously a value. They are not, but it's not the kind of competition in the free market as housing or commercial space.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
There's a question in the chat.
Yes. So Bara, I believe, says, I would love to hear more about the gender impact assessment.
Oh, well, the gender impact assessments are a tool that has been put forward for gender mainstreaming policy by international organizations. As you know, this is part of the gender mainstreaming toolbox. It's gender impact assessments. And gender impact assessments of urban development plans are a very new thing. I mean, in Spain, they are a kind of a legal requirement, although there has been some disagreement because we have this decentralized planning system in which some competences are national, most are regional, and so some legislation that comes from Europe, such as this related to gender impact statements, is translated in different ways. So there's an irregular way of taking this into planning, and only very recently it is being acknowledged as something that has to be done, because there was a court decision that canceled a plan for not having it, and so now public government, municipal governments are in some regions are starting to think that they have to do them, because otherwise plans could be cancelled at the court level, because this has started to happening. So, and this is very recent, it's absolutely recent. So the gender impact assessments that we have done for the modification of the urban development plan of Madrid for the Madrid Nuevo Norte, this big renewal project, it's practically the first time it's done in Spain. I mean, so we have had to devise the methodology to see how to do it, because there's the gender impact assessments that come from other fields of policies are not transferable in any means to planning. Only in very general terms. You do a state of the art, what's the current state, what the plan aims at, and then what are the possible impacts of what the plan aims at, and how you can improve, what recommendations you can improve so that you mitigate possible negative impacts, or even propose things that improve the possibility for advancing gender equality as a result of implementing the plan. But this is very different in this field of policy, in planning, in urban planning, as compared to other areas. So the way we did it is to look at the spatial implications of spatial design of housing, how it relates to transportation, how it relates to facilities, about public space and green areas. I mean, the thematic, the normal areas you look at in planning, and looking at how these impact care and women's lives and the lives of the young and the elderly, and how they would, and how the solutions proposed by the plan really contribute or not to improving care activities and safety concerns and reduction of some other gaps between. That's the way we did it. But I'm saying that this is it's very new, and we still are now working on some criteria that would be, because the legislation doesn't say what should be the content of these impact statements, and so we are exploring it and we are defining it, and so it's a practice that needs to become more ongoing.
Other questions? Any other questions? Well, I have a question. I guess this, this kind of fundamental question of accessibility and, maybe sort of minimizing trip chaining to a range of care facilities, from the broader sense of kind of city design or city planning, is it something like the idea, we call it in the US like complete communities, where every, sort of kind of residential or mixed use space of neighborhood scale or bigger has within a certain sort of distance or time access to really a kind of full range of both work activities, but also, care activities, consumption activities, et cetera. I mean, is that part of the kind of fundamental strategy to try to build these in? Is that a kind of end result of this? I'm just trying to imagine it at the kind of scale of city or neighborhood planning.
But what is it? I didn't get the last part of the question.
Well, I mean,
the last part.
I guess when you think at a kind of, larger scale, and you're trying to really address this issue of care in terms of, time, work life, stress, et cetera, would the strategy be to really have, or the ideal strategy to be to really have within a certain proximity, the kind of full range of care activities, from consumption activities to
absolutely. That's that's a point. Yeah, how to improve that, how you can do all these care tasks in the minimum time. I mean, how you can maximize, and so it's an issue of spatial temporal dimensions, space and time dimensions around the home, but also around the workspaces. And also because employment very often is long distance. How do you, what do you do with that? And although I think that now with the post-pandemia, and the increase of telework, so some of this will be reduced, and some facilities for work in the neighborhoods will have to be developed also as infrastructure for teleworking, because in many cities around the world, homes are not prepared for work. The housing stock has not enough quality to work from it. So, and in any case, it's not possible to work when you have the kids around. So you need to go to, even if you work at home, you need to go to another place to work in the neighborhood close to the home, because it's not possible really to do it in the home. So I think this will open up new possibilities of improving, if it's properly addressed, of improving the way we can manage care and employment in the future, and all by the increase of telework and if this is properly organized in neighborhoods. Yeah. But then things also need to be done at the other end in employment centers, because many people will have to keep on going there. So this has also to be managed. How can you improve things so that some care tasks can be undertaken in employment, that this is improved in employment centers? Some of the things you have to do for your daily living can also be done there. Yeah.
Do you think emphasizing, building these care facilities around the workspace, given the data you showed about male versus female activity patterns, do you think that would push men to be more maybe
who
force
knows?
them to be more engaged?
I have doubts. Maybe yes, maybe not. We have the experience of what happened after World War II, when men were in the forefront and women took over the jobs in industry. But then when the war was over, everything came back not to normal, but even more seclusion of women in the homes. And I think that one thing is that probably will happen after the pandemic is that many jobs will be lost. And many of these will be women's employment, and even among those employment that is not exactly women's employment, that many women will have to drop their jobs because it's impossible to continue to do their care activities and also work under pandemic conditions. And when there is little employment, there will be a tendency to favor men. Which is what happened after World War II, and there are also many reasons for that. So because the care activities, so I think that there is a strong possibility that one of the ways out of the pandemic is reduced participation of women in the labor force. But it will again occur. There will also be variations, and across countries, depending on how the economy is contracted or not, and what sectors appear as new sectors of activity, and again, it would also depend on public policy, because there will be policy options that would allow to keep women in the labor force. But the tendencies, I have this fear that are there, and that they will be strong. I'm seeing how difficult it is for young mothers with kids. I mean, these months have been hell for them.
Other questions?
I have one, if no one else has one. So you're doing all this work, you said, at UCLA. So what types of things from Spain are you bringing over that you're trying to incorporate into the work you're doing there?
Well, at UCLA, the pandemic got me there. So I came to do some research on how to. I have the topic I'm working on is the one specific topic I'm working on is in addition to these projects, this consultancy work that I do with a team. I have 2 people who work with me, but the project I'm working on, the research the problem that I'm working on, that is to reconcile. There are like 2 strands of feminism that have different practical implications. There's one, what is called feminism of equality, and what is called feminism of difference. And the practical policy implications of these 2 approaches can be quite different, and can also sometimes even be contradictory and opposing. And we have a feminism of equality mainly looks at ensuring equality in the workplace, and feminism of difference looks more at the specificity of women's lives, at valuing that and addressing the implications and policy needs of this. And these 2 are coming into conflicts, for instance, in Europe and in Spain, on the issue of equal non-transferable parental permits. We have now, we have come, for instance, in Spain from a situation in which mothers had a very small maternal permit. Well, you have even less in the US, even less, but as compared to European standards. And suddenly, the government has approved a much bigger permit, non-transferable, and for men too. And I think this is not the right thing to do, because this is undervaluing the specificity of what maternity is. It's not considering sufficiently what are the needs of newborns, which it's mothers that they need. It's not. Of course, they also need their fathers, and also mostly they need them, but when they get a bit older, they need them more. But when they are really babies, it's really their mothers. And there are also health issues and psychological and emotional things. So I think that having these equal, non-transferable big permits that suddenly have put Spanish fathers at the head of Europe on an equal base with Swedish fathers, I think it's not the right. So I'm working on how to bring together these 2 conceptual approaches and building a common ground, because I think there's an over-emphasis on equality in the workplace issues, and there needs to be a better balance, and that these 2 things that we need to build them on common ground, so that the policies really take into consideration appropriately the specificities of women's lives too. And so I'm working on that. This is what I'm doing now.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Other questions? Anybody? Anything in the chat, Brittany?
Nothing yet in the chat.
Okay.
Oh, okay, we just got one. So, Shaw would like to know, what have you seen of the comparison of the incorporation of gender-conscious planning in different areas? For instance, Spain versus the US versus Nairobi. Are some places much better than others, or have most places just begun to incorporate gender-conscious planning?
Well, it's very new. So there are the most significant experiences are those of the city of Vienna that started doing very interesting pilot projects, starting from housing, but then public space, then transportation, then neighborhood design in the early 90s. Prior to that, there had been interesting things in the UK, in the Scandinavian countries, in the Netherlands. Now in Spain, there's quite a bit going on also. In Latin America, there has been a lot of work addressing safety issues because Latin American cities are really unsafe for women. And so there has been a lot of work to address safety, and which is also a part of the work that UN Women does through the Safer Cities program. But then as an overarching or ongoing approach to planning is very new. So it's not something that is really being done on a normal basis by local governments or regional governments. For instance, I was a couple of months ago, I was contacted by people from the University of Madison, and they wanted to apply the work that I did for the Basque government to the greater Milwaukee area. And so we have prepared a research project that we have presented to a foundation and the regional, the metropolitan governance organization. It's called SURPAC, I think. From the greater Milwaukee area, they were really interested. So we have prepared together, the three of us, so the Greater Metropolitan Planning Authority, the University of Madison, and us, who have prepared this proposal, and let's see whether we get the funding to do it. I would really like to do it. So it would be really nice to see how these ideas might apply in an American metropolitan area. Yeah.
Any other questions? We'll have another question. So as you were just saying, I mean, I'd be interested because while these issues are, kind of part of the discourse in the US, they don't seem as kind of coherent or specific as, in terms of direct applications to both broad and specific planning issues. I guess this, the case of University of Wisconsin and Milwaukee could be, well, it could be an indication that, this kind of more specific framework could be very valuable here. Have you noticed other things in the US where this is, sort of foregrounded more than it seems to be, at least to me?
Well, my colleagues at UCLA, Anastasia Lukaitu and Evelyn Blumenberg, they have done this work on women in transportation. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of research in the US on women in transportation that was originally even funded by the Federal Housing Administration since the late 1970s. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of, this is a very serious empirical quantitative research. But then moving from that to action, it's a different thing. Yeah. So, and also, I mean, the great original research work was the one done by Dolores Hiding at Yale, at the School of Architecture in Yale. But Dolores Hiding is a historian. She's not a planner. So she did this wonderful analysis. But then I am not aware of anything translating any of this into practical terms. Yeah, I'm not aware of anything really practical or happening in planning in the US. Mm-hmm.
Anyone else? Any questions in the chat, Brittany?
Nothing so far.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll bring it to a close, and thank you so much. It was really...
We have one more, actually, if I can interrupt.
Okay, go ahead, please.
All right, so it's from Bara, again. Wants to know if I want to incorporate this into teaching, where do you begin?
Well, you need to get a basic bibliography, I think, first. There's quite some bibliography. And then you can also get some of the experiences and some of the research. I just got yesterday, I got a contact from a colleague from Italy, from Florence, who is setting up a master's program on this. And she sent me the course content she was preparing so that I could help her making comments and so on. So if you want, Bara, maybe I don't know, I can get you in contact to this Italian colleague. I teach a class where I teach the basics. So hi. Yes, I mean, we can talk. We can talk.
Bar, if you need any, with Inés Sánchez, if you need any help making the contact, just, because I have the email or whatever, but.
Their email's in the chat as well.
Oh, okay. Okay. Anyone else? Okay. Well, again, thanks so much. It was really, really fascinating. It's really the way that that you define this massive sort of field of research and the kind of European approach is extremely helpful and illuminating, and really certainly I teach kind of basic planning history and theory, and I talk about gender, but this really has certainly sort of expanded my view, and I think the audience's view about really how to delineate the issues and actually bring the issues into concrete planning activities. So thanks so much. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you to you. It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me and for organizing it.
Yeah, no, our pleasure. And
thank you.
Thanks so much. And there's several emojis and so on, hand clap emojis and so on.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Ciao. It was amazing. Ciao.